Then he says, God has given us, who's us? He's writing to the church, us the Christians, us the church, us who've made the firm decision that Jesus is our center. God has given us the task of telling everyone what he is doing. Then he says this, we're Christ's representatives. Other translations say we are ambassadors. You know what an ambassador is? An ambassador is a representative of the country that they're representing, right? So I looked up. I was like, okay, what's the job description of a modern day ambassador? There's ambassadors back then. We still have ambassadors today. I was like, okay, what's the job description? Of course, Canada didn't post theirs. The U.S. did. So here is part of the job description of a modern day ambassador. Okay, so here's the job description, right off the job description of an ambassador of the U.S. All ambassadors officially represent the U.S. government on behalf of the president in treaty negotiations, immigration discussions, foreign and aid projects, and humanitarian aid programs. That's what ambassadors are. That's part of the job description. So get this. When Paul says to the church, you want to know what your identity is? You are an ambassador of God. In other words, you are the official representative of the King of Kings. Right? Responsible, he says, responsible for helping others get along. Right? Treaty negotiations. The church has got to be at the forefront, right? Immigration discussions. Come on in to the body of Christ, right? Foreign aid projects, humanitarian aid projects. We have a responsibility as ambassadors. Now watch this. When the king shows up, the ambassador loses their job. You don't need an ambassador where the king is. Canada doesn't have an ambassador for Canada. Our prime minister is here. Right? Like we don't, the U.S. doesn't have an ambassador in the U.S. The ambassadors represent where the president isn't. So when the king shows back up, we're not ambassadors anymore. But the fact that we're called ambassadors means that we're called to colonize this territory as representatives of the king. So watch, in 1808, the king of Portugal, who thought Napoleon was going to attack Portugal, moved himself and his entire government court to Brazil and set up in Brazil. And Brazil was a colony of Portugal. There was an ambassador there. As soon as the king showed up, the ambassador lost his job. He's no longer needed anymore. The king was there. The entire court, where the king went, the government set up. Eventually, a number of years later, the king moved back to Portugal. And the ambassador then had a decision, and this is when Brazil became its independent country and all the rest of it, because the ambassador that was left behind, actually a relative of the king, decided, I don't want to go back to that role again, representing you. I kind of like how you live. And they created rebellion, and Brazil became its own country. But the point is this, is that when the king's there, there's no need for ambassadors. Our identity is when Jesus said, I'm going, and it's going to be better for you that I go, because now you're going to be your representatives. We're the representatives. We're not waiting for God to show up on earth to fix things. That's what I'm saying. We're not waiting for God to show up on earth to fix things. We're his representatives with a purpose to fix things. And it all starts with, who am I and what am I called for? Then look at this. We're called to be his ambassadors. Then Paul goes on and he says this. God uses us to persuade men and women to drop their differences. Other translation says we've been given the ministry of reconciliation, which we could say that and go, yeah, nice. But wait. This one hit me like a ton of bricks. Eugene Peterson's interpretation of the ministry of reconciliation in the Message Bible is that God uses us as ambassadors, calls us to be ambassadors. God uses us to persuade men and women to drop their differences. Not to create more differences. Because come on, as a church, Big C church, not just our church, but as Christians, the world knows more what we stand against than what we stand for. The world knows more about, you got your boat, and your boat ain't anywhere near our boat. And the world looks at the church and goes, I don't want to get in that boat. That doesn't look like a far better life. You guys are against everything. And yet, the reason why the church is so confused, and the reason why we as Christians are so confused, is because we didn't know that our assignment is to be a representative of the King of Kings. And that assignment, that job description, is to persuade men and women to drop their differences. Not with us, with each other. How many think we got some work to do? That it's our job, King, to get everyone to get along? Huh. How many thinks this changes some stuff? What we do and how we do it. God uses us. God uses you in your workplace to persuade men and women to drop their differences. God uses you in your neighborhood to persuade men and women to drop their differences. God uses you in the city, me, to persuade men and women to drop their differences. And enter into God's work of making things right between them. And then he says this, we're speaking for Christ himself now. And this is what we speak. We're speaking for Christ. That's heavy responsibility. And we're saying, become friends with God. He's already a friend with you. In other words, he died for you already. He died for everyone. He created that we can all be in the same boat. He's already a friend with you. Wow. Jesus said, love one another as I have loved. And Jesus modeled this. Come on, we're supposed to be representative of Jesus, speaking on behalf of Jesus. Jesus modeled this dropping the differences better than any other human being in history. And it started with Jesus calling his disciples. Because you look at this. Jesus had some crazy dudes around him. Like, the most unlikely. Like, Jesus called Simon the Zealot. You know what a zealot is? A zealot is basically a terrorist. A Jewish terrorist, and zealots were under the mandate of, we're going to topple Rome. And we're going to get Rome violently. They're going to violently attack and get Rome and overthrow the government of Rome. We're going to take down the government. So that was the zealot. Jesus said, hey, Simon, the zealot, terrorist, come and be on my team. Okay? Well, he's like, okay, you're on my side. That's what we automatically assume. You want to be with me? You're on my side. Then Jesus calls Matthew the tax collector. What was a tax collector? A tax collector he was a Jew who was an employee of Rome. So you had someone who says, I'm going to topple the government, and someone who worked for the government. And Jesus said, we're going to be on the same team. Huh. And then Jesus went to the Samaritan woman. And Jesus went to Zacchaeus, the tax collector's house. And Jesus talked with the Pharisee, and Jesus healed the Roman centurion's daughter. Jesus did everything to reconcile the differences and said, hey, all y'all, we're all in the same boat. It doesn't matter where you're born, or what your job is, what your past is. We're all in the same boat, and I came for everyone. And then he says, then as Paul's saying, then he gave us the assignment to do the same.